next few months. If you've been following some of the work around the strategic plan, we've been having conversations about the value that our diverse community brings to the table as we talk about the work and how to make effective few months. If you've been following some of the work around the strategic plan, we've been having conversations about the value that our diverse community brings to the table as we talk about the work. Okay. So the value that we place around the diversity in our district and our community at large. Part of the work that we hope to do through these conversations is learn from you some of the things that you value as a community, some of the things that we want to focus on as we continue to develop our leaders and also develop the conversations within the schools. One of the things that we've established throughout our schools is equity teams that focus around looking at potential areas of disproportionality or areas that we want to address because certain student populations aren't doing well. And then have deeper conversations around why these populations of students need to be further supported, or what programs within our schools we have to further develop to make sure that when we talk about our students, we're talking about all our students and how we are well supporting them. But also have conversations around what are some of the things that we have to continue to work on as a community, and what are some of the things that we need to identify as priorities to further develop and engage the work as a collective. And it's very important that as we're having these conversations with our school leaders, and they're looking at patterns and trends in their buildings, and what are the things that we need to do as a collective, that you're also aware of some of the work that we're doing, and also building understanding of some of the things that we're bringing to the table as we continue to value diversity in our schools, but most importantly, as we continue to have a focus on all of our students and making sure that all of our students are successful. So if you've been part of some of the conversations we've had around the strategic plan, there's been a lot of priority and emphasis around how do we serve all, and what does it mean to serve all? So today is one of a two-piece series, and we're gonna be doing the series in 2 sessions. So we'll have session 1, session 2, and then we'll cycle again the same session. The second session will be offered in Spanish with English translation because of the large population of Spanish-speaking families that we have in the district. And it also gives you a perspective of what it feels like to come into the work not knowing the language and having to hear somebody translate information as others are engaging and embracing you in the work. So it allows kind of an equitable approach of people experiencing both sides of the pendulum, and also an opportunity for members of our community to have access to resources in their primary language. Today, we are offering interpretations in Spanish and Haitian Creole for those families that might need it. Como estaba explicando ahora, tenemos interpretadores aquí en esta reunión en español y en español y en Haitian Creole. Si hay un padre que necesita traducción, pueden tener acceso en la parte de la presentación donde dice interpretaciones, y pueden tener acceso de esa manera. So we want to make sure that through this process, not only are we embracing in these conversations, but that we're also providing access to all of our families so that they can build their awareness regardless of any language barrier that might exist. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fergus from Temple University that will be leading some of this conversation and kind of giving you a glimpse to some of the learning that not only our school leaders have embraced over the course of the year, but also some of the learning experiences that our teachers are starting to experience as they immerse themselves in their equity teams. I'm sorry, I'm like, this mask is hot. So he will kind of walk you through some of those experiences, but also make this as interactive as we immerse through the conversation, so that we can have kind of a collective dialogue and not just frontal presentation. So, Dr. Curtis.
I think I turned, yeah. I'm gonna stand on this side. Hi, good evening, everyone. You know, actually, I'm gonna take my jacket off because myself and Cecil Barnes, who's in the back, and Tanya Leslie, we have visited 19 schools here since Tuesday. And I feel like this is a little bit more informal and we can have, so I can take my jacket off, right? And it's after 6 o'clock. So that signals like, oh, we should be just a little bit more relaxed. So I'm excited to see folks here. Thank you for coming. And for those who are online, who I cannot see, I'm sorry, welcome to the first of two sessions that are really going to orient, the intention around these sessions is to help us sort of do some common knowledge building around sort of what is it that we necessarily mean around the element of continuing to develop and grow the types of systems that are responsive to the populations that we are serving, right? You know, one of the things that we're always very conscious of within our field of education is recognizing that the science of learning also involves a level of recognizing the adaptability and responsiveness to the range of realities that our kids are coming to the table with, right? And so that also means that which, as educators, as we come into the field and the course training that we get, right, brings us to a particular juncture, and then we get into schools, and then there's a myriad of other things that show up, right? Ways and conditions that we're not primed for, right? Ergo, the pandemic, right? None of us had, I mean, I think and as I've interacted with so many educators over the last 18 months, for many of them, they didn't realize that they were getting a pseudo degree in public health, you know, a master's in public health in a way that never even imagined, right? And running that alongside, how do I keep my kids safe? Not just now healthy, but also culturally safe and socially safe. So part of our work that we're always trying to be mindful of is making sure that we are attentive to sort of the breadth and depth of sort of what we have capacities around. And so the work that we've been doing for the past year and moving into this school year and supporting all of the schools here in Norwalk is how do we keep growing that responsiveness with a particular attention to understanding sort of the mechanisms of school systems that, as best intentions may exist for how we do things, there's always a degree of shortfalls that occur. And what we want to make sure is that we are clear about those shortfalls, rectify them, but also being clear around sort of how those shortfalls affect particular groups over others, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of where those shortfalls are, you know, but and what's necessarily the impact. And I'm going to share with you some data points that we've been using with all of our schools, right? That they're really using to really harness their work moving forward. But today, what I wanted to do was, this is my first entree in terms of sort of interacting with you all as a community outside of the school, including sort of school folks here, is I thought I'd do just a little bit of knowledge building around sort of commonly understanding, like, what is it that we necessarily mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Particularly given that there's so much sort of a fever pitch set of dialogue that's happening around it. And I'm always very mindful of, let's make sure that we all have a sort of working understanding of it. So we're going to do a little bit of that, right? To kind of get us at a place where, of what we need to be thinking about. But to get us started, I'm always trying to be mindful that as we continue to seek that broader vision of really being an integrated society, that we've got to always be mindful of how do we keep practicing it on a continuous basis, you know? There's a research scholar who wrote, I remember her writing this in one of her books years ago, and it really stood out to me when I read this, where she talked about how, as we came out of the civil rights movement and we were legislating changes that were necessary, we realized that part of the legislating sort of these types of systemic changes, right, where we were changing the ways in which housing had been promoting segregation, the way schooling has been promoting segregation, labor force and so forth, we realized that there was, as we were making these legislative changes, we were putting into the water stream for our community that we need to learn how to get along. But the difficulty is, like, we didn't have a roadmap or a curriculum for how to get along, right? And so we're just making do as we can, right, as a society. So that's why I'm always sort of attentive of trying to do, whenever I have these moments, let's practice some of that getting along, right? And some of that means just some of the simple things that we can kind of practice together. So with that said, that was a dramatic pause, but I don't know.
Did I turn it on?
It is, yeah, it's on. It's not, and I'm clicking and it's not moving. Oh, okay, there we go. I'll point at the, I'll point there. All right, so this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna do a quick activity. Trust me, this will be the only activity I do for tonight, okay? I promise, all right? I had other activities in mind, but I said, no, let me keep it simple this time. Next time, we're gonna do a few more, right? But the intention around it is just for us to give us an opportunity to kind of practice out loud sort of this curriculum of how do we learn about each other, because how often do we actually sort of expend the energy to get to know each other? And I always think back to my own kids, when they were in elementary school. They're 17 and 21 now. And we chose a integrated school, right? A school that had a 25, 25, 25, 25 sort of representation of various racial and ethnic groups. But I realized when that also provided us an opportunity as parents to kind of get to know sort of communities that we hadn't traditionally gotten to know. And I can say that moment of having that integrated school experience has meant that now some of our closest friends come from that experience, right? And having been an intentional sort of integrated environment. So we got to practice this all the time. So this is what we're going to do. So I want you all to pair up, well, first I want you to think about your name. Whether it's your first name, middle name, last name, nickname, surname, right? And I want you to think about the story behind your name, right? And I want you to just sort of think for a minute or so about that. And then I want you to turn to a partner and share a little bit about the story of that name, right? Just as a quick sort of dyad around sort of what is the significance or storyline behind that name. So we're just gonna spend about a minute thinking about that name, and then when you're ready, turn to a partner, right? So if you came with somebody, turn to somebody else. Right? I see some folks who came with, all right? So think for, if you got a name and you're like, oh, I got a story, as I'm thinking about it, and you're ready to turn to your partner, go right ahead, all right? And for those who are online, think about your name, right? Do the same activity. And what I like for you all to do is to use the chat feature to just share a line or two telling a little bit of the story of your name.
Not to get to Q&A right at the end, then I'll have some. You just give us a second.
Because this was a webinar, I guess we're going to set up no chat. They can raise their hand and they can talk.
They can talk. Oh,
Yes,
okay,
they
gotcha.
can unmute themselves and they
Okay.
I just said it's
All right, so
an
maybe what I'll
talk.
do is I'll say,
If you have any questions, that's
right,
fine.
exactly. Maybe I'll ask like maybe one or two. I want to see, just to integrate them into the.
Oh, I agree, definitely. I just, like I said,
Yeah, exactly.
normally turn the chat off.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha. That makes sense.
Well,
All right.
I can't break the meeting.
No. I hear you. Thank you.
All right, we're going to wrap this up in 35 more seconds. All right, wonderful. I always love sort of watching these activities because the energy that folks have about telling their own stories and being able to kind of do what I'm going to talk a little bit later about is perspective taking, right? It takes an opportunity for us to kind of sit and listen to somebody else's story to really sort of begin absorbing sort of the dynamicness that we all bring into the room, right? And especially knowing, I'm going to talk a little in a little bit about how even our name sort of becomes a representation of elements of our cultural attributes, as a quick, and I'm going to do, usually I do a broader share out and just have people sharing out, but because we're doing virtual and an in-person, I'm trying to find a equitable way to kind of get virtual people in the room, and I haven't figured it out yet, so I will just be the one that shares. So, so as a quick example, my name is, my family name, well, my family calls me, and my name has always been, my name is Eduardo, right? And when I came to the US, when I was about 10 years old, my third grade teacher asked, what's my name? It's one of those new kids who arrived and, they see on the roster and like, what's your name? I say, Eduardo. Some people call me Eduard. And they said, well, I'm not gonna say that. I said, so you can be Eddie or Ed. So for me, I'd watch a lot of American TV, and Ed was a horse, right? I wasn't gonna be a horse, right? So I've been Eddie ever since, right? And so for me, part of what Eddie's become is sort of very much my English translation of myself, right? Being a Spanish speaker, as my first language and my cultural reference point, it has meant, what has been the levels of flexibility that's been allowed in terms of my name and what Eddie's become over time, in these different spaces. And it's interesting, I haven't really, even my mother, when she read my first book, which, I included a little bit about my own story, and my mother read it, and she was like, "You never told me this story." I said, "Well, we were going through a lot of stuff." I'm like, but that became sort of very much a sort of part of my journey of how I sort of recognized the ways in which I had to make adaptations throughout the course of my lived experiences, my educational trajectory particularly. But what I appreciate is recognizing that we all have a story that we all bring into every part of our conversation, every piece of sort of what happens. And, we're cognizant of that as educators. We think about the kids that show up in our schools and how their names are very much a representation of the stuff that, I use this analogy, and I'm going to talk about it a little later, is that everybody has a shopping cart filled with lived experiences like that, right? Their name is in that shopping cart, and it represents something significant, right? And I'm sure for those of you who have kids, you think about the names that your kids have, and you can remember the moment when it clicked for you, like, that's their name, right? There was something that triggered it, or there was a moment, or there was somebody special that you're remembering, right? And we want to be cognizant and of recognizing sort of the importance of sort of what that signals and about our kids, that we're actually sort of, that we're here to really support in both their, and not both, but in their cognitive development, in their social development, their emotional, their physical, and their moral development. And that's the work that we always want to do. So this work around diversity, equity, inclusion is multi-layered in an endeavor like education that is multifaceted. It has so many tentacles that are attached to it, right? So we have to be at a place where we kind of understand what all this stuff is. So I am going to, yeah. Oh, there we go. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of community common languaging with each other. So I'm going to really, go into diversity, equity, and inclusion. So just so at least we have a frame that we can work from. And then I'm going to, on the back end, I'm not going to do homework. I do that with all the principals who are here, know that I love to give homework. Or no, I take that back, not homework. One of my kids' former elementary principal called it extended learning, right? So I'm not going to give any extended learning, but just some things to kind of take back to your own set of community spaces that you live in, whether it's your own household, your neighborhood, or what have you. So I can't help myself. All right, so a couple of things. I always like to use this sort of what I call a contract of norms of how we talk, and really sort of wrestle through something that as a society, there's levels of imperfections that we've been experiencing over time, and we've got to keep working on getting better at it, right? But that requires that we sit from a place, we have a particular place in which we are approaching this, right? So a couple of things is, one thing is let's be cognizant that we got to push our growing edge, right? Meaning, in education, there's this theoretician called Vygotsky. So Vygotsky talks about this idea of zone of proximal development, meaning, we all may be here, but there's always another place that we can arrive at, and what's between here is called a zone of proximal development, right? So the question becomes, how do I get supported to get moved over to this space? And then when I'm at this space, how am I getting to this next space? So, and part of that means that we've got to be at a place where we can be comfortable with, like, I got to push my growing edge, right? I got to be, it's kind of like when I go to my trainer, which I don't go anymore because he was pushing me too much, is recognizing that we always have growth to do, right? He's always saying, like, Eddie, I think you can do a few more pounds heavier. I was like, no, I can't. He was like, you don't know if you can push yourself, right? And once I do it, I'm like, oh, I didn't know I could, right? And so how do we maintain an orientation that is about pushing that growing edge? I want to consider what's in it for us and where we're trying to go, who we are as individuals and what we're tasked to do. I'm always very mindful of, with my own kids, is my kids being cognizant of having continuous experiences where they're in this cross-cultural moments, right? I want them to engage with sort of multitude of folks, right? In a way that is constantly growing them, right? Because I think that's so vital for our kids, because the society they're walking into, the workforce, the post-secondary environments, right, include such a multitude of folks from different places and different languages, right, that it matters for us to be mindful of, like, that's where we're trying to go with our kids. I want us to sort of listen with respect and stay engaged during our time that we're here. I want to recognize that struggling together and experiencing a level of discomfort is okay, right? It's kind of, I always liken it to, there's moments in a marriage, for those who are married or partnered, where you're just like, oh, this is going to be uncomfortable. Oh my goodness, what is this all about? But that uncomfortability is a good place to be, because you get to wrestle with some of the muddier stuff, right? And we've got to be okay with wrestling with that muddy stuff, because that's the stuff that's got to be cleared up. And we want to take these spaces and recognize that there's going to be moments where we may feel uncomfortable, but I want us to be comfortable with that uncomfortability and knowing, like, oh, but it's part of my zone of proximal development, right? It's going to move me. And then lastly, I'm always very cognizant of that. We want to speak our truth and respect the truths that others are bringing to the table, because everybody has a story that they're bringing in that is that they're sharing and they're coming in with. And part of my strategy of always, where I'm like, I'm not sure I completely understand, I always ask the question, can you tell me where that comes from for you, right? It's that point of, like, I'm trying to ask for clarification, because I don't know your shopping cart. I'm not sure what's in it, but it's coming from something. And, let me take a moment to kind of do some perspective taking to kind of gain an understanding. So I want us to sort of, to do that as we do this, have this sort of norms. The last thing I'll mention as part of our norms is I want us to normalize that conversations around diversity are, there's three core tensions that are always at play. Mika Pollack, who's a sociologist out of UC San Diego, she writes a great deal about sort of these tensions and how they show up. And these tensions are, they're at a personal level, they're at a structural level, or they're at strategies level. The personal tension is am I ready for this? Can I handle this? What are we doing? What do I know? Who am I talking to? That's that personal tension of, like, what am I doing with this? Where am I going with this? Do I know enough? Have I read enough books? I love when folks sort of tell me, Eddie, what book should I read next? I'm like, okay, let's take a moment out of the books and let's just live it out loud, right? Then there's the structural tension. The structural tension is our environment, our structures, our organizations, are they primed for this type of sort of pushes, this type of zone of proximal development growth work for us to do better, right? And at times we realize, and we've realized here in Norwalk, that we haven't been at a place where we can grow that and expand that, sort of really trying to be attentive to how we address particularized issues. And that's an important tension for us to name it, because we got to grow it. We've got to sort of walk through and really deal with those tensions. And then the last one is around the strategies tension. Do we have enough in our toolkit to know what to do and how to do it, right? And managing, that's a tough one, because it's there are times where we will do any old strategy to just pray and hope that it works, right? I call throw the spaghetti on the wall and pray that something sticks, right? But we want to be careful around that strategies approach, that we're recognizing that we're trying to contend with stuff that's very complex. And so that tension around strategies is really like, I don't know exactly what's going to work. I don't know exactly how we're going to address it. But that's why we got to sit in a level of uncomfortability and really sort of think strategically around this. And part of what myself and my team have been doing for the last 3 days is we've been meeting one-on-one with every school principal. So we were able to, as of 4:30 today, we got through 19 schools, right? And really sort of work with them as they're thinking through sort of the strategies tension. What do we do? What are the right next steps for addressing these very particularized issues that we have? So I want to be clear about that. That's our reality, right? That's the norms we want to have, but it's also recognizing and being okay with, like, there's some tensions that are going to arise, right? Whether it's personal, whether it's structural, or whether it's strategy-based. All right, so I said I was going to cover 3 topics: diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Because I want us to kind of swim together around this stuff. So let me start first with diversity. So diversity is recognition that there is a multitude of elements of who we are, right? That is what we mean when we're talking about diversity, right? So that means that we have to be cognizant of, well, what's the lens? What's the diversity lens? that we want to enact, right? What is a way in which we kind of approach and sort of own and carry this diversity lens? And so one particular sliver that I'm always trying to be mindful around diversity is that there's so many various elements of diversity, right? It's diversity by race, by language, by ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, but what's a place of sort of commonality of how we think about diversity in all of these areas that we can work from, right? To help us really sort of wrestle with the complexity of diversity. And I always like to, in sociology and anthropology, we always go back to, particularly anthropology, really centers us thinking about culture, right? Culture is a way in which we have shared values and norms and beliefs that a group sort of really sort of not only sort of carries, but also sort of transfers from one generation to another, right? And there will always be pivots that happens from one generation to another in terms of how they do certain things, right? I was just in Panama last week visiting family, and I had mentioned something about raising my kids, and my uncle looked at me, was like, "Well, that's not how we do it." I said, "Yeah, because I made a pivot. I made a cultural pivot, right? That I'm doing something else, right? It was around, how, I've allowed for my kids to have a sense that, if they disagree with something that we're doing, that to give them a platform to be able to voice it, right?" And my uncle was like, "No. But that's not what we did. We didn't raise you guys to, And I said, "I know, you transferred from one generation to another, and then we just pivot. We did a cultural pivot, right?" So what's important for us to recognize is all of us have these cultural elements that we're carrying forward from generation prior, living it as a current generation, and then transferring it forward, right? But there's so many layers that we have to be attentive to around this culture piece, right? So as a quick example, and now I want to be dramatic. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Ralph. So the way in which to think about culture is think of, because there's so many facets to culture that we all carry, that we're not going to know everything about everyone, right? That's why I'm always like, I may not know everything, but I'm at least willing to ask the question where the spaces that I don't know, right? And so beginning pieces, I like using the analogy of the iceberg, right? So there's cultural elements that live above waterline, right? The stuff that's sticking out of the water that we see often about cultural groups, right? And I'm sure we see different representations of that, of how we have been able to earmark when we can recognize particular cultural representations, right? Representations like, Irish dance, right? As a representation of sort of an above the water representation of Irish culture, right? Where I live in Yonkers, it is a deeply Irish community, right? So that's why I use that example, because I have learned a lot more than I thought I ever would, right? Because I'm in the neighborhood, right? And it's my kids, my youngest, when they were in daycare, the daycare provider was Irish, and her accent was heavy, and she used certain words that all of a sudden my son started using. And I was like, what is that word? What is that, right? And he was absorbing some of these cultural elements that she was sharing, right? We see it in Chinese New Year, right? We see as a moment of above the line representation of culture that's representative of Chinese culture, right? The Chinese New Year. Mariachi bands, right? Representative of Mexican culture, right? And those moments, that it showcases for us an element of that above the water, sort of what we know and understand. But the dynamic that we also need to understand that there's stuff below the water, right? What particularly this first part is like some of the unspoken rules, right? That subtle ways in which conversational patterns, ways in which people will talk or signal things, right? That are subtle, sort of unspoken ways in which cultural groups kind of interact with each other that we may not know, right? Language that's used, right? Like there are moments when my wife is hanging out with her friends and they say certain words and I'm like, what is that? I don't understand. She's like, you don't need to know, right? And it's because there's something else that is particular to how she talks with her friends, her close female friends, that is particular to them, right? It's an unspoken sort of pattern. We see that in the ways in which, like for the New Year, part of Chinese culture, right, that you give crisp monetary gifts to individuals, right? A close friend of my mother-in-law, who's Chinese, would always give our kids every year the red envelopes. And it was usually crisp $5 bills. Of course, my kids were like, whoa, I am rich. I said, we're gonna put this away, right? But one of the things that we wouldn't know, an unspoken rule, is you don't give anything with a 4 denomination, right? Because 4 means bad in Chinese. The 4 sound like the word bad in Chinese, right? So we wouldn't know those things, right? Those are some of the unspoken rules. Hula dance, oh my God. I'm like, what is this again, right? So it's funny because we see this all the time on TV, like, oh my God, they're greeting us at the airport and they're doing a hula. Well, actually, it's supposed to only be done during blessings and in particular when we're doing remembrances, right? And it's mostly female, right? In terms of hula dance, right? But we wouldn't know that, right? Because we usually see the above the water versions, but then there's the below the water versions of this. These last two representations are what's called the evil eye, right? That generally, I know in my culture, we give the evil eye to a baby after they're born, right? To ward off bad spirits, right? And many cultures, several cultures have representations of what's called the evil eye or el mal ojo, right? As a way to kind of ward off, right? I've now seen, on Etsy, I see people doing the evil eye like it's like a thing now, right? And I even saw a tattoo where somebody had it. I was like, oh, you have the evil eye in your, they were like, oh, is that what that is? I said, yes, right? But that's because we've gotten used to above the water stuff, but there's below the water sort of cultural representations. And then the last is sort of way below the waterline, that subconscious set of patterns that are existing that is in some ways kind of hidden to us, that we wouldn't necessarily be obvious to us because we're not part of it, right? We're not steeped in it, and we can get lost in it, right? So for example, I think about sort of a group of kids in my neighborhood who are skaters. Like there's a way in which they talk to each other about what they're doing that is like, I wouldn't even come close to understanding what that is signaling for each other, but it's a cultural sort of fabric that they have constructed as part of sort of their own hidden culture of how they kind of operate as each other. Starbucks, I'm a Starbucks fiend. I'm there all the time. Do you too, Thomas? Yes, all the time, right? There is a way in which we talk in Starbucks, right? Half calf, almond, slow drip, high drip, right? Like there's language. Only those who frequent, right, who know that language, right? And so I get frustrated when my wife comes with me, and she's like, how do you know, what are you saying? I was like, it's our culture, right? It's how we talk in here, right? And those are just some of the ways in which some of that way below the line sort of cultural elements that exist, right? And so part of what we have to be cognizant of in this diversity span, right? And understanding that there's so much diversity is recognizing that there's so many layers to the cultural representations that are surrounding us, right? That we may be privy to some of the stuff that's above the water, but give ourselves permission to also recognize, wow, there's probably some unspoken rule stuff as well, right? I may not be necessarily too privy to it, but let me ask, let me inquire, let me be at what I like to call, or what social psychology calls a cross-cultural stance, where I'm willing to ask the question and explore, let me gain a little bit more understanding to just sort of feed myself. All right, let me pause there for a quick minute. Thoughts, reactions so far? I want to make sure that as we think about diversity, that this is the sort of a place of departure that we use to kind of think about diversity.
I'm wondering if anyone, Rob, also remotely.
Oh yeah, so we want them to raise, because they can use the raise hand
They
feature.
can actually just unmute themselves, they all have rights to talk, even though you can't see them, so they can just start speaking.
Okay, but can they raise their hand?
What's that?
Can they raise their hand?
Oh yeah, they can raise their hand.
Okay, so if we can ask, yeah, so for those who are online, if you have a clarification question, go ahead and raise your hand, so that way we'll know to tag you into the room. And then folks in the room, if there are any clarifying questions or thoughts or reactions that you may have so far. All right. I love it, right? I want to make sure I have enough moments of checking for understanding. All right, so that's diversity, right? So when we're talking about this, there's a lot of sort of languaging around diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we understand that that's what diversity is. Understanding that there is a multitude of sort of understanding the variation of who we are. Yes?
Yeah, I do have a question on this, because how does this tie in with cancel culture? Because I don't understand, there's like two sides to this, and it's confusing.
Right.
You know, you see a bunch of people just getting canceled. I was shocked the first time I saw it was a university, Midwest, who it was supposed to be anything else, it was in 2015. And I was so shocked that 20, 30 kids shut down a speaker in front of a couple thousand people and completely got away with it. And then that's since become the norm. When we look at this world with diversity, where's the diversity for the people who are shouting, and everything you're saying? I agree with everything you're saying. You should be, trying to get to know the other people.
Right.
Understand where they're coming from.
Right.
Well, how does it start?
Right. Well, that's a great question. So I think, part of what we have to distinguish is, so I think in that example you just gave is a representation of, especially in a college environment, and maybe other environments as well, is recognize.
Big tech, do the same thing. They're canceling people. How is that embracing diversity when you cannot explain?
Right.
Are so against the very thought of another person that you distinguish that thought.
So that's what I want to distinguish. I want to distinguish sort of the First Amendment right to be able to say there's a disagreement, and that may involve for some groups, like, I kind of want to protest. I kind of want to say, something, I disagree to the point where I'm ready to kind of protest about it and request you don't show up. But that lives within that sort of First Amendment right of being able to speak on that and sort of really sort of provide that sort of vantage point. That's different from the idea of, I think what's maybe misconstrued around the idea of cancel culture is that part of what we're also needing to add into the sphere of cultural representation is that there are a multitude of cultural elements that have historically sort of left out that limits the perspective of what we all understand, right? So, I think sort of there have been many sort of historical moments that have been really sort of challenged for us in terms of sort of how we kind of understand sort of how we understand sort of the diversity that lives amongst our group. So, for example, one of the things that I've been doing for probably the last 10 years, and my kids kind of hate me for it, but we go down to DC, we go to all museums, but in particular, we spend a lot of time in the Native American Museum, right? I know that for me, that is a cultural space that I know very little of, right? Because there's been a manner in which my own K-12 experience has given me sort of limited understandings, touch points of knowing sort of what are the different sort of storylines around Native American experiences, right? And having gone to that museum so many years now, I've realized sort of what it's meant in terms of how I come to understand the cultural representations of Native American, because I haven't had the opportunity to kind of know about how Native Americans, how the treaties actually sort of transpired, because if you haven't gone there, they have examples of the treaties and how the languaging, right, was utilized in such a way that it forced movement away from sort of lands that they had, as well as, one of the things of being an educator, I was fascinated by some of the trains that were picking up Native Americans to send them to schools to reform them away from what some of the documents you saw said, to remove the savageness from the population. And those were, and I appreciated sort of having those moments to kind of re-engage my own sort of educational experience, because this was things that were left out from my K-12 standardized curriculum for me to actually know. Yes. Oh, we got somebody on there?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. I'm gonna unmute David.
Okay.
Is his name?
All right, go ahead, David.
Okay, hi. So my question, I am a little versed in DEI. My curiosity is, I mean, this is for Norwalk Public Schools, and you've spoken to many people. I understand that. I'm wondering what kind of problem is it we're trying to solve here? Because right now, our children, our school systems, we're rated number 25th country in the world academically. And I don't see how this is going to be benefiting them. This isn't going to teach them math or science or reading and writing. And I'm worried that, we'll get into the equity component, I'm sure later. But I have a question on like who's pushing this? Like who voted for this? Why are we doing this right now? Given everything that we have many other things that, need focusing on. Is this a priority?
Right. So thank you, David, for that question. So there's a couple of sort of touch points, I think, to your point around sort of the why, right? So there has been a priority in particular, since 2001, ESCA, which is the Elementary Secondary Education Act, that every school district that has a disparity pattern in terms of the underperformance of particular groups have to come up with a plan for how they systematically are addressing the issues tied to why we see these patterns of underperformance. So though they're, I think you said 25th in the country, right? It doesn't
No,
mean
we're
that,
America is 25th country in the world academically.
you're talking about the US, right. But it doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean that it is a shared experience where everybody is living out that being the 25th, right? So the attention around, and this is what I'm going to get into in terms of defining what equity is to provide us an opportunity to note those differences and address the systemic set of issues that are playing a role with that, right? So your point around, how we teach reading, math, science, that there is complexities of how it is rolled out that hasn't necessarily been equitable for everyone, right? And I'll show in a little bit how examples like, in some of our programming, we have an underrepresentation of some groups, right? Like, so for example, our multi-language learners are not existing within our gifted programs. There's limited representations of them in gifted programs, right? And what we have to inquire is like, sort of, what is it about sort of our processes that are leading into this? And part of what we learned was like the assessments we were only using English-only assessments, right? That lent itself for having only English-only sort of kids. So our multi-language kids, who also demonstrate giftedness, weren't getting opportunity to get in there. So we realized, wait a second, we've got to expand the assessment tools that we're using such that we are truly sort of providing the opportunity for the kids who we know also demonstrate sort of giftedness, having them kind of sit within those set of, in that example, sort of gifted programming. So to your point, why are we doing this? There is federal mandate that we're supposed to be addressing issues around underperformance, as well as there is federal regulations that states have to follow, then turn school districts have to follow in terms of addressing patterns where there is an over identification of students in special ed, a over identification in suspensions, right? And as well as patterns in which who's getting into gifted AP and honors, right? So there are guidelines that we're following, right? That we're needing to sort of address. And as a school district, we have to be earnest about sort of really doing that work, right? And part of that means that we're gonna have to wrestle through an understanding of the complexity of how some of these issues have arisen in a space like Norwalk, right? I'm always very mindful that all the districts I get to work with, there is always a level of uniqueness to how these problems have necessarily organized themselves, and at times metastasized, that we have to be attentive to how we have a response habit that gets us to a better place of actually sort of having a better effect that we're seeing in our set of programming. So, so I think this, so as we think about diversity, and I think we're starting to lean into sort of the concept of equity. So we're gonna move into that dialogue because I think it's a good place for us to recognize that as we understand the need and beauty of diversity, that it also means that we have to pair it up with equity, right? And so equity, I'm gonna skip to the next slide. There we go. equity provides us an opportunity to begin examining the nature of some of those inequality patterns, right, that I was just mentioning. Also the ways in which sort of there may be systemic conditions that are occurring, right? So the example that I gave around the assessment tool, the English-only assessment tool we were using to identify kids who are gifted, to place them in gifted programming, right? What are the systemic conditions that gave permission for that to happen, right? And what did we have to shift in order to say, well, wait a second, we've got to expand sort of the nature to which we have assessment tools that are cognizant of the different languages, so that that is not a barrier for us identifying who's gifted, right? And similarly, in sort of other spans of our practice, being aware of some of those systemic conditions. So equity is a lens that allows us to kind of do that deep dive around it, and in a way that I'm always, you know, and the principals know this, and I'm always asking, like, so it's, what is our inquiry stance that we're sitting with as we do this? Like, what's the questioning that we have to do it, right? I'm always hesitant for folks to give an answer right off of seeing data. I'm like, let's inquire about this a little bit more so that we are super clear that when we get to a point of remedy, that we are, we're not throwing spaghetti at the wall, but we're actually being surgical about what we are getting an opportunity to actually do. So let me give some of the disparity patterns here in Norwalk, right? Some of the data that is representative of sort of what's happening. And this is disparity data. I know some of you may have seen it, because I know I've presented it to board members, to several, I think we've had several board sessions where I presented some of this data. I'm not showing the full deck of all the data. I'm just showing maybe like 4 or 5 slides of data to kind of help you all sort of understand that there is, this is the dimension of the sort of patterns of inequality that exists within our system. And I'm focusing on the 3 particular areas that I pay attention to within my own research and applied work: special education, suspension, and enrollment in gifted AP and honors, all right? So real quickly, just to kind of give some framing, this data here is looking at enrollment and overall enrollment and special education patterns. And what I want you all to orient yourself to is the bars all the way to your far, I don't know what that, unable to connect to OTA, sir, okay. It's shutting down?
It's actually not online, though, so.
Okay. Okay, oh, I could have done that. Okay. So I want to go over here, and so folks are online. I am pointing at the enrollment columns. So this is the enrollment patterns for our district, right? So as you can see, you know, our Asian students are about 5% of the district, our Black students are about 15%, our Latinx students are hovering a little over 50%, our white students are about 25%, and our multiracial kids are about 4% of the school district. And what we see, the rest of the columns are representative of special education identification, right? So I'm just gonna go through them real quickly. So the first one is the overall students' disabilities, right? So this is the percentage of students by these same racial groups that are in special education, right? So that includes all the categories. There are particular categories that are of specific interest, and these are the ones that are here: emotional disturbance, learning disability, speech or language impairment, or OHI, which is other health impairments, right? And for those, for clarification, so OHI, other health impairments, that's typically where you have ADHD as a subcategory within OHI. Now, what we always want to pay attention to is what you see in terms of enrollment, in terms of the percentage. We want to see a proportional representation in all the categories. In other words, all things being equal, there should be a proportional representation of our student populations in all these set of categories. Again, all things being equal, right? And you can see, if you quickly look, we use the green bar, which is our Latinx student population, right? You'll see that there's a level of proportional representation when we look at overall student disability, emotional disturbance, learning disability. We see a slight overrepresentation compared to enrollment. And then when we get to speech language, we really see a huge difference between their overall enrollment, which is around 51%, and then speech language impairment, which is around 61%, right? That's what's called an overrepresentation, right? We want to be at a proportional level to enrollment, right? So this is just begging questions for us, like, okay, so what's happening that's leading to this particular pattern of this group being identified speech language impairment, right? The same thing as we look at all these other groups, right? Our white students are about 25%. I'm gonna go to the emotional disturbance here. They're about proportional, so they're about 25%. Learning disability, they're underrepresented, so they're under 20%. Same thing, speech language, they're about 20%. But when we get to OHI, other health impairments, our white students are actually overrepresented compared to their overall enrollment, because there they are about 43% compared to 25% of the school district. And we have to ask the question, all things being equal, what's transpiring that we're seeing sort of this pattern of disparity, right? And so we note that in special ed by race. And then when we look at it by gender, again, special education by gender, in terms of male, female, right? Again, enrollment is over here on the left, and we want to do the same comparison. You know, so blue bar is male. I can't believe it was blue. I don't know. That wasn't my doing. That was this PowerPoint. And we compare. We go across to see where is there proportional representation of male students, right? And we'll see that male students are about 51% of the school district enrollment, and they're nearly 70% of students identified with emotional disturbance, right? Or speech language and other health impairments, we also see an overrepresentation of male students compared to female students in terms of the enrollment. And we want to ask the question, what's transpiring? What are all the steps that are involved in the process that may be playing a role in sort of how we understand what's transpiring in that pattern? Yes?
Quick question. Is that, if you're looking at that data probably is from the last year or so. How does that compare to 20 years ago, 30 years ago, where you not have those old stats?
Say it again. So how does
The data here, right? Probably from 2019, 20,
Yep.
21. Is there comparable data back from 2000, 1995, 1980? You can do a truly comparative test to see is there really something going out of whack, or is it just because most guys are, you know, hope that they're not really young and they're going to act out. They can't sit there.
Well, so the couple of things you just laid out. So one, you know, part of what we have to be mindful of comparison points is we have to be mindful, especially around special education identification categories, is that particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, they have shifted in terms of what falls under qualifying for those categories. So the comparison with 20 or 30 years is not going to be, it's not the right means test for us to do. So that's why it's better to really do sort of more of a 5-year. And what we do know is that there is a similar pattern. There's also a similar pattern nationally, right? But the second point that you raise, I think, is how we, you know, as you said, you know, the ways in boys are, right? And one of the things I always argue, you know, try to sort of get us to think about is there something special about boys that makes them predisposed to the disability categories? Or is there something about the manner in which our systems are operating that may tag them a little bit more frequently, right? Because there may be some of these cultural understandings, right, that we maintain about how we understand boys who can't sit down doesn't necessarily constitute a disability, right? It just means they're just not sitting down, right? In comparison to what may be the normal distribution of sort of how kids are at different age groups, right? And I think, and that's the stuff, that's the inquiry we have to do within our educational sphere, because as I said, we all bring shopping carts into school. So how does, do those elements like you just described, how does that sit in our shopping carts as practitioners in how we are interpreting boys' behavior, right? And play a functional role in sort of how we are, how our processes operate, all right? All right, so I'm gonna do, oh.
You got another question?
Oh, okay.
Hey, sorry, it's David again. So quick one. With this, I mean, this is, again, this is, to me, seems like a great collegiate exercise, and we're looking at data, but how is this meaningful? You know, you're saying we don't have past data. we have only recent data, so this snapshot in time, but how is this meaningful and I mean, how is this going to be helpful for them learning?
How is it meaningful for the students?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the ultimate goal, right? Is to make them successful.
Right. Well,
And
it's meaningful for the students because we get better as practitioners to take a moment to really look at the what I call sort of in education we have to do both a skydiving view of what we're doing. So this is a bit of a skydiving view, and then we've got to do a scuba diving view of what we're doing because we have to be mindful of that the practice of our field requires that we're constantly attentive to the nature to which how we do what we do is going to carry some levels of imperfections. So we have to be able that's why there's always improvement plans that are happening around schools, because we're always making sure that we're sharpening what we get to do, and that's what's meaningful for students to learn, right? And if we don't do that tinkering, we're just going to continue sort of a pattern like this, particularly, let's say, to boys, where we may end up with a society where we have categorized a great deal of boys as having a particularized sort of orientation, but the concern around that is, especially in special education, is the nature to which there's a loss of exposure to the full curriculum when we're continuously identifying large groups of kids, right? And that's an area of concern that in education we've been attentive to, is recognizing that that which is happening in special education in of itself also needs continuous improvements, right? Because at times it's resulting in our kids aren't making progress, right? And so that's why that's the impact that it ends up having with our kids. For them to be surrounded by practitioners who are in this improvement sort of orientation about sharpening what they get to do in the science of learning with our kiddos, right? So that's why this is important, right? We get to get better as educators, just like any profession gets an opportunity to get better, right? We get to be better as educators. You raise your hand.
Yeah, I just have a real life experience and scenario growing up here in Norwalk. I don't know if how much of this is curriculum based, but growing up and going to school here, I had assumed that I hated reading, and I had assumed I hated reading, and as you know, Black History Month is delegated to this February. Until I started seeing characters, stories, and books that looked and reflected. As the story was told for such a long time, it was, what's in Africa, slavery, that's it. What's in Africa, slavery, and that's it. So you start hearing stories about all of the great inventors and such. Aside from that, it also revealed somewhat of an inferiority complex that I didn't even know that I had. So this is the importance of, a more inclusive, and this is just American history. I hate the name critical race because I just hate that name. This is just American history. So just the personal experience of how certain omissions can lead to certain less interest when it comes to curriculum. That's all.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you, and I appreciate that. And I think, also the relevance of sort of constantly knowing what it means for us to really expand and deepen what we have available for our kids is so critical. Yes?
Quick question. It's a plan out there, so I have to ask.
Okay.
Are you guys actually getting better?
Are we getting better?
Are there methods that show definitively that by applying these kind of different strategies, so on and so forth, that overall education of kids has been getting demonstrably better since, I don't know, 1970, 1980? Is there a back pattern that is that? It seems like we're doing this every 3 to 5 years. We rejigger the entire normal school system, move around, we're going to do the whole new curriculum, so on and so forth. I just wonder, are we getting better? I don't know.
Well, so the short answer is yes, right? So there are various areas where we can annotate when districts have had an opportunity to really stay the course, right? That they have gotten better in terms of not only improving their practice, but also it having a result with kids in the sense of sort of the sets of opportunities they have available, but also the nature of performance. And those performance ranges from our assessments that may focus on reading and science and math, but also the rate at which we're attentive to the graduation patterns, right? As well as the lessening of kids who are dropping out, right? As another metric of how we're getting better, right? So we know that it does occur with districts that have had an opportunity to really work on it for a while, because part of, like right now there's in education, we're dealing, just like the workforce, the broader workforce is dealing with a workforce shortage, right? In the schools, we're dealing with a workforce shortage, right? And it's going to complicate the ways in which we can keep improving when we're having such realities that are happening for us. And so our attention, and that's why it's so important for us to stay the course around this, is for us to really do this continuously, to keep sharpening and getting better around the work that we are as practitioners in the work that we get to do with our kids, right? I spent myself and my team just spent the last 3 days, and there's several schools where, when we started from last year, and they have data points to be able to showcase how they've gotten better in terms of the rates at which, and I'm going to show this in a little bit, the nature of who they've been able to identify for gifted programs, right? Where they demonstrably show, like, wow, because we changed these sets of criteria, meaning we moved away from an English-only assessment to actually having an additional language, to actually sort of looking at not just one data marker, but actually have multiple data markers, we realized we missed out on like 10, 15 kids who are demonstrating giftedness, and now we're able to kind of pull them in to those set of experiences, right? And those are touch points of improvements that we're realizing, we're getting to see, right? Even in an environment like we had last year, what I like to call sort of a bit of an interrupted education experience in this pandemic, to still be able to see levels of improvement. And that's the stuff that keeps us hopeful about wanting to keep doing this, right? And because it's complicated. So the realities of what goes into sort of how these dynamics are happening are things that we have got to keep in front of us and keep thinking about sort of how we actually do this. So let me give another example, another data point. This will be the last few ones. All right, I don't know what's going on, Ralph. Oh, wait, sorry. Okay, I did that one. Okay, so then this is patterns of suspension. Again, we have enrollment on the left side, and then you have unique student suspensions. And what I mean by unique student suspension meanings, it is a representation of what we call a student count, not a suspension count. Suspension count is the total number of suspensions. A student count is unique students who've experienced suspension, right? So it's not a kid, that data is not representative of a kid who's had maybe 4 or 5 suspensions, right? And what we see is we see some differentials between, all things being equal, that there's differences in who's experiencing discipline by race, ethnicity, and the same thing by gender, right? And within each one of these, we have to ask the same set of questions, like, is there something particular about the population, or the ways in which our programming, our strategies, our interventions work, right, that we've got to improve, because it's landing in a way that's resulting in these specific patterns of disparity, right? And that's what an equity lens allows us to at least ask the set of questions, right, specific to our populations that we're serving. And the last is in terms of what I call advanced programming, which is representative of gifted, AP, and honors, right? So we see the exact same sort of pattern. We look at enrollment on the far left. We compare it to advanced programming sort of in patterns here. We see under and overrepresentation of various groups, and the same thing by gender. And if you look at this, particularly, this will be the last data slide, you'll see that our female students are highly represented in our advanced programming, from gifted, which starts in 3rd grade here, if I remember correctly, all the way into AP and honors, right? But I will say there's a caveat for the AP and honors that for girls, their overrepresentation doesn't show up in all subject matters at the high school level, right? So there's still a disparity in terms of girls being underrepresented in the science and maths advanced courses, right? You had your hand up?
I was gonna ask again, I mean, you're doing all this with race, but what about family structure? Broken family, coming from a single parent home, a two-parent home. Is that same applying these metrics? Because from what I understand, that's one of the major determinants of success in school.
So
I know you guys can't do any of that.
right, well, that's part of, so on one hand, it's like we've got to be cognizant of what we have control over in terms of the four walls that we can do within schools. Two, also being cognizant of that though kids may have a range of sort of home environments, right? Even kids who may come from a level of sort of middle class or affluent homes may also have sort of troubled or, set of environments that how we are receiving and experiencing and supporting our kids, we also have to be, part of our work is being responsive to that reality and malleable in a way where it doesn't dictate the ways in which we are going to decide, well, something, because they come from that home environment, maybe they do have a disability, right? Or maybe right, we've got to be very mindful of how that, that doesn't necessarily is not necessarily a one-to-one equation, right? That's simply because, you have a particular sort of set of environments that it is a determinant for a particular set of outcome that we're seeing here in terms of whether suspension or enrollment in gifted and AP and honors.
Well, are you guys actually, are you looking at that issue about single parent households or not?
That's not data that's available. That data is not, yeah.
That's an interesting point. So you are deciding, you and a small group of people will be deciding programs, I guess, and how we deal with all this kind of stuff. But if you're not taking that into account, you're only coming out from a very limited view of the world and missing out that possibility. I'm not saying that possibility is overwhelmingly poignant, but it could be.
Right.
So that's the problem with equity, because equity is always, it bestows the power on the equity decider, unconscionable power, which can be abused.
Well, so a couple of things. One is, I'm going to say it again, there is no available data for us to be working from within the span of within education. That is not part of our data systems, right? One. Two, also being cognizant that for the sphere of like the, who's deciding, it is the folks who have really poured sort of their, both their educational experiences, meaning in terms of this is what they've gone to be trained in, to get masters and doctorates around, to really hone in and leverage their best understanding and the research and the evidence that's available for us to really sort of address these set of issues. So it's not sort of a small cadre of people, but it is, I'm thinking about on Tuesday, the big meeting that we had, there are about 70 people in that room, right? We're all thinking together in terms of how we are addressing.
I haven't heard the argument, but that's in fact, Barack Obama said, one of the key determinants is having a two-parent household. I know that, I came from a single-parent household. So I know that you can get off track in the process. It wasn't my stepfather, I would have gone off track.
So again, I was just going to say, I said, look, I think there's no doubt the importance of a family structure, the range of family structures that are available, but I just want to make sure that it's not determinant of a disability category or of a suspension.
But if all this vast knowledge got together in a room, it seems it's kind of a common sense issue. And why would that not be a fundamental building block of any type of education program going forward?
So,
recognizing this issue, recognizing the issue, knowing that it's likely to have, particularly among boys, that they're going to be much more problematic.
because they are coming from single-parent homes, or?
Yeah, broken single-family parent homes, yes.
Well, I think that's.
Apparently, there's such clear data on there from in other, psychology and sociology and things like that. They know that this happens.
Well,
It's not education.
so just to be clear, so that set of data which comes out of Brookings Institute, which comes out of Urban Institute, because I know that set of data. It's Brooks Gunn who've been doing that research for years. What they show is a correlation, but not a causation, right? Meaning that there's a relationship, but we don't know whether it's directional, right? And I think that's something that we have to be clear around in terms of understanding. It doesn't take away from the importance of family structures, the range of family structures, meaning the individual who may come from a single parent home, the individual who may come from a two-parent home, or an extended family home, right? That we want to make sure that as educators, that we're clear that how we organize our work is not premised on a presumption that, well, if you're not two family, then I'm not sure we're going to be able to provide you support. We want to be nimble enough in all of our work that we're cognizant. It's not lost on any educator the realities that kids are dealing with, because our kids tell a lot of truth to all the adults in school settings in ways that adults really they really strategize around, like, okay, what are the support services I got around to be able to help this kid who's going through this tough context, while also I want to make sure that they're able to have a level of success. So your point around why don't we bring it in? It is brought in, right? But we're also mindful of how do we address and support that work, particularly sort of knowing that there is only a level of limitation of what schools can do without a partnership. That's why schools partner with community-based organizations, or when it's necessary, needing to partner with a city agency, like Child Protective Services or what have you, or a food bank, right? Like, I've been visiting schools where I see that they have food pantries for kids who are still hungry, right? The pandemic is still going on, and families are still having a level of interrupted economic means, and schools are trying to do their best by partnering with others who can provide that type of support. So it is present, it is part of, but we're also trying to be mindful of where the lanes of what we can support around, and how do we bring in partners to kind of help our kids, right? So that we are also not utilizing that as a determinant for whether or not we're going to provide the full breadth of our educational experience. We got somebody online?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, it's me again. Yeah,
Go ahead, David.
so we get into the diversity part. We'll stick to the diversity of male versus female. Again, you're talking about this data. It doesn't accurately show the females academia and AP whatever. There is a fact that, what is it, like 40% of males are successful in college as of like today, and that has been trending that way for like the last at least 10 years. And so, you pull this metric, and I'm wondering, are you trying to be predictive, and then you try and work backwards, and then, work to the causation, and then try and work back to whether, let's look into their family life. And, it's kind of like, well, who gives you the right to go back into all of that? And why is it your mandate to do all of this? This should be about educating our kids. And, there are some kids that, are meant to play football and be NFL stars. They have different strengths than, maybe you go to, you get an MBA from a college, you really like books and all that, and that's your thing. We all have strengths and weaknesses, and this is a time when kids should be trying to figure out what it is that's going to make them happy in the future, that they're going to be successful at. And the whole equity thing, if you're trying to make a level playing field and, give some kids extra attention, not even extra attention, change an entire program for kids based on level setting it, you're keeping the academic accelerating kids back. You're keeping them from being challenged. And on the flip side, you're putting other kids that aren't capable, maybe, you're putting extra stress on them, making them feel bad. And then, if you want to get into it, you start saying, oh, well, this is because you're white, or this because you're black, or you're Latino, and this is the way this is, the way you're supposed to be. So we have to now change things. It's racist on its head, this entire thing. It's not right. It's not right at all. And, you know, it's divisive. And I don't know why you're trying to divide our culture, our people, and all of this. For what? For more power over our families and kids? It doesn't make any sense to me. You're not helping the kids achieve. That's what it should be all about.
So thank you, David, for your various points there. And I'm going to touch on a couple of them. The others, I think this isn't the venue to kind of really touch on. But so the first, I want to just clarify information point, right? So nobody's made, or I haven't made the reference that I think you used the language of looking into people's families or going into families. And that's not what I said. I said when kids are demonstrating struggles that are beyond the scope of what schools have available, we tap into partners who can help support families, right? We know that there's only a sort of a boundary of what's available for schools in terms of resources to be able to support families, but we also don't want to ignore that there's some of our kids who are struggling, right? So kids who have limited food, right? Or kids whose family at times will come to schools and say, you know, I don't have, you know, my shelter has been compromised. I don't have shelter, right? And for some families, schools are one of their few conduits for them to seek help. And so when I say we're bringing sort of that information in, it is to respond to and provide support where it's appropriate, and we have the avenues to be able to do that. We're not going to, as educators, we're not going to ignore kids and families who are suffering, right?
Absolutely.
So that point that you made, David, that's not even close to what I said. In terms of sort of what is it that we're paying attention to. You know, in terms of sort of this idea of divisiveness, right? I want to be clear that, you know, talking about and thinking through the complexities of who we are as a society, as a diverse society, in of itself is part of the ongoing struggle and work that we have to do as a society, right? I know how I exist as myself and as an individual, how I walk through the world. I am cognizant of sort of what's living in my own sort of cultural, you know, iceberg. All the great stuff that I get to experience, and be cognizant of sort of what others I interact with also bring to the table. That level of sort of understanding of each other is not something that is divisive, but also sort of provides us an avenue for us to actually build better relationships with each other. So I want to be clear around that. Knowing more is not necessarily a place of divisiveness that we need to kind of stray away or codify it as a level of divisiveness in this work.
So would you agree that divisiveness is not diversity? That's not what I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about the segregation of people here. So when you put down on a spreadsheet, you know, you got, I know for a fact that certain programs in our schools, they have a list and they say, okay, this accelerated program, right now we have, you know, 15 white people, and we have, you know, 10 Asian people, and we have 5 Black people, and we have, you know, maybe 8 Latinos. Okay, well, we need to get more Black people in this program, or, you know, we need to get more Latinos in this program, because now it's, you know, there's too many whites and Asians in it. And, you know, even though they're academically achieving maybe higher, then maybe they lose that opportunity or no longer challenged, you know, or accepted into that program just based on race.
So
And
I
it
just want
should
to
be about
clarify,
achievement.
I want to
You know,
clarify
it's like Malcolm X, you know, would be rolling in his grave.
So I want to clarify some misconceptions there, because one, that is not sort of the orientation of of what's transpiring, in paying attention to when we see this distribution, being able to ask ourselves the question, so what's going on? What may be some of the practices, right, that may be transpiring? Just like I gave the example around, I'm going to go back to our English language learners and gifted and talented, right? That the manner in which we organize our assessment set up a barrier where they weren't going to get in, right? Had the level of demonstrated giftedness, once we switched and we added in a language-based assessment, we realized, well, hot damn, we actually found more kids, right? So we were missing out on that opportunity. So when you raise that point, I think we have
But
to.
you could focus on that specific issue and have them tutored, right?
So
Get them
David,
special
so
tutoring.
you have to, so hold on, because I'm trying to finish here, is that we have to understand that there's a system that we have to really sort of pick apart to understand sort of what's happening to make sure that it's equitable for all of our kids. And which has resulted at times where kids who have potential aren't getting the opportunities to get those potentials exercised, right? So, and I think in some ways it may create sort of this misnomer that there's some kids who are smarter and other kids who are not, simply by who's ending up where, right? And in fact, we're actually missing out on the potential of tapping into more kids because of the ways in which our systems are operating. And that's the premise of what we're doing. And so I just want to be clear about that. We have another question in the room.
Mine's more of a statement. I've been a teacher for 17 years, so I just want to kind of come back to why it is that we're here, why it is that we're listening. We are serving all students. The keyword is all. So when we think about the way in which education transforms over the course of generations, by all the students who are in our classrooms, who are in our schools, who are in our communities, we as teachers, principals, community stakeholders have to be looking at multiple entry points, and the way in which discussions are had, the way in which questions are asked, the way in which tests are given, all of that has to be looked at. And so to just be looking at one kind of avenue of, for example, what I just heard, like getting tutoring, well, we're public schools. And so being a public school system, what is within the classroom walls should be serving everybody.
Right. Thank you for sharing. So I want to sort of move forward, because I want to make sure that, I'm trying to be mindful of time, is that we get to expend a little bit of energy kind of defining what is inclusion. And so let me skip here. We did quiz. All right, so inclusion. So when we talk about inclusion, we've got to recognize that there's ways in which how we are understanding the facets of culture that necessitates us to translate that into a particular set of habits of what we do, right? And to get to that means that we've got to be cognizant of the ways in which how we may understand our own cultural vantage points may bias us in terms of how we operate. So as a quick example, my team and I, we've been staying at a hotel in Stamford, and we were fascinated by, as soon as we pull up to the hotel, it's all stairs. There's no ramp. And we were like, well, wait a second, where's the ramp? And, because one of my colleagues was trying to take out bags and wanted to kind of carry it, have one of those thingamajiggies, that you put this luggage on. I don't know what it's called. Trolley, I guess, I don't know. So there was nothing. We asked, we're like, oh, where's the ramp? They're like, oh, you got to go through the back, underneath the garage, and into the back, there's a ramp that you could use. And so that was a moment where you realized, well, wait a second. However this was constructed, the architecture of sort of these stairs, right, had a particular point of bias in terms of individuals who were able-bodied, who could walk up these stairs, right? What wasn't sitting at the forefront was sort of the lived realities of individuals who are not, who have disabilities, who are differently abled, right? And that's what we have to sort of, when we think about inclusion, it involves us sort of reconciling where are the touch points of biases that we kind of live with, right, that we have, that we've got to interrupt, so that when the next time we're building out a hotel, that we're cognizant of, like, something, we got to put a ramp here, right? Because it's not just going to be individuals who can walk upstairs, right? There's going to be other differently abled people who are also going to be attending or coming to our hotel, and we want to make sure that we have them at the forefront. And so this bias piece is something that we all carry, right? There's a level of bias that is kind of sitting in front of us all the time. And so I'm going to talk about two quick ones, right? Which is what's called in social psychology it's affinity bias and confirmatory or association bias. So affinity bias, real quickly, is we all gravitate towards people that are like us, whatever that like us is, right? Like, I'm a big runner. I've been a runner for 35 years. Like when I say I'm a runner, like I'm a run, like I have in my back of my car, I have easily 4 pairs of sneakers, I got shorts, I got t-shirts, so if anybody wants to go for a run right now, I'm ready, right? Because that is my affinity place, right? And I have those hidden culture pieces about runners, right? And so when I see other runners, I'm like, oh, we know each other. We understand sort of our cultural elements. But what we have to be mindful of is when we have those affinity groups that operate in ways that are about exclusion, right? That we have to be careful about sort of what that does for us in terms of how we orient ourselves in terms of who we choose not to interact with and who we do, right? The other type of bias we've got to be careful around is what's called associational or confirmatory bias, right? That we all carry, right? Which is the idea that we seek at times information that can confirm sort of a particular stereotype that we may have, right? A couple weeks ago, I dropped off my youngest at school, and I was getting back on a highway, and I see this individual coming onto the highway off the ramp, and they're like speeding, and I'm like, oh goodness, one of those drivers. I'm like, let me move over, let them get on, right? So they aggressively gone on to the highway, and then part of me was I was kind of bothered. I'm like, oh, I hate when people do that, right? They sort of have to be so aggressive about getting on the highway. So I said, you know something, I want to see who this person is, right? I know many of us have done it where we're like, I want to see who this person is. It's almost like we want to kind of take a mental picture, because I'm going to hold on to that picture. But in my head, I had this idea of like who this person was going to be. I thought it was going to be this young guy with a big beard, and like I had this picture. And then I pull up next to this person, and I look, right? And it's an elderly woman. And I'm like, ah. That was a moment of my associational bias sitting right in front of me. Like I was seeking that confirmation, and I realized, oh, that's not the right bias to carry. That realizing, wait a second, aggressive drivers can show up in any form, right? So how do we make sure that we are attentive to those sets of affinity and associational biases that are constantly sort of showing up for us, that are present, right? I'm always saying we have to find ways in which we interrupt it, right? So that was a moment when I saw that person, I said, okay, I got to interrupt this idea that I have about aggressive drivers, right? So that I am reconfiguring that an aggressive driver can show up in any shape or form, right? And so how do we carry that forward in the work that we get to do in schools is that we're attentive to those touch points of how those things show up for us, right? And there's ways in which I always say we are always consuming different layers of affinity and associational bias, right? So a quick example, Aunt Jemima, right? Or Aunt Jemima, depends on how you pronounce aunt or aunt, right? Has a long history of really carrying a very specific representation of Black women in sort of what's called as a mammy characterization, right? That's the history of sort of this caricature that's always lived in sort of as a product, right? The bottom left is the new box, right? Because I realize that part of it is when there is limited to no representation, and this is the only representation of Black women, we're consuming in that moment a level of associational bias, right? Where that's some of the sort of picturing that we have. And it shows up in multiple areas, like Band-Aid, right? It was recent in the last 2 years where I think, what is it, SC Johnson, that is the owner that owns Band-Aid, I think. They realized, well, wait a second, nude or flesh tone, the idea of flesh did not include everyone. It was not representative of everyone, right? And now they have sort of this range of skin colors. So now I can actually buy Band-Aids that kind of, people can't see standing out when I have an injury, right? We see it also in other sets of subliminal messaging, right? This particular picture here is the same product, right? It's a baby carrier, right? And you see sort of the differentials between sort of what it looks like in terms of representing a two-parent household versus a one-parent household, and what is, when you have limited imagery or representations of a particular group, what happens when the characterization in this example of a Black female, how does that subliminally sort of also carry a level of associational bias, right? And we have to be mindful of sort of how our products kind of feed us some of this stuff on an ongoing basis. What's the work that we do to interrupt it? the ways in which some of our sports teams have historically, I already told you about my passion and really sort of work that I've had to do in really understanding the story of Native Americans. You know, what it means that there's the few imagery carries sort of this mysticalization of Native Americans, right? You have a variety of now teams that have reconciled the significance of what it's meant to have that sort of characterization over time of groups. Again, examples of ways in which our association of bias kind of carries us forward. This is a curricular example. This is a McGraw-Hill, this is the geography book in Texas in 2015, where if you look at the caption on the side, it reads, the Atlantic slave trade between 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States, right? And the rest of the body of the text talks about workers existing within the US. So for the last time I remember, workers is different from slaves. Workers they got lunch breaks, right? They may have benefits, right? There's a different connotation around workers than slaves, right? Because slavery had a particularized system that allowed for it to kind of persist, right? And so what does it mean that there is these touch points of how that type of association of bias gets carried forward? I'm gonna skip sort of this. The last one I'm gonna mention, or no, second to last one, you know, the Peanuts gang. So I don't know if many of you remember Franklin. So Franklin showed up in 1968. Charles Schulz writes about in his autobiography how when Franklin showed up in 1968 and throughout the 70s, Franklin couldn't sit on the same side as the rest of the Peanuts gang, right? Because what was articulated to him is that that's not a representation that we want to showcase kids of this America, right? And so the manner in which sort of some of that subtle orientations, that affinity bias that is being demonstrated, even in something as innocuous as Peanuts, right? The places in which sort of, as something like this, in which Franklin was kind of hanging out with the rest of the Peanuts gang. I'm gonna skip this example, but the point being that we always have, we have to be cognizant of the ways in which, in order for us to maximize or develop a level of inclusion as a strategy, we've got to be willing to interrupt some of the ways in which we're also fed some of these biases, right? I'm always very aware that biases are, at times, are subliminal or subconscious for us, right? I'm always very cognizant of my wife and I, we've been married 23 years, and you know, the ways in which, she's really good about reminding me of what it means to be a supportive partner for somebody who has a career, right? And what it means for me to understand when she tells her story about work, how do I operate as a partner who recognizing how she has to live out in the world in a way that I don't have to, right? She has to think about safety in a way that I don't need to. She has to think about how she dresses when she goes to work in a way that I don't have to as a male, right? And those are some of the sort of realities that exist, but how do we interrupt it, right? What are the ways in which we interrupt? And this will be the last thing that I'll mention. So in social psychology, since 1958, when Gordon Allport published The Nature of Prejudice, right, which was a seminal piece in social psychology around how do we understand the confines of discrimination and prejudice, how does it operate, right? Psychology is good about sort of really the psychological underpinnings of what gives us permission to behave and operate in very particular ways. And since then, there's been hundreds of research that's really extrapolated, well, what are the strategies to interrupt that? How do we interrupt some of those touch points of bias? So there's 5 particular strategies that they have noted that we've got to work on a continuous basis to interrupt. And I always put this as, this is part of the inclusion work we need to do, right? When I talk about sort of that hotel having the stairs, right? How do they use some of these interruption strategies? How do the architects use some of these interruption strategies so that they have in mind individuals who are wheelchair bound, right? So I want to walk through each one real quickly, and then we're going to wrap up. First one is what's called counter-stereotypic imaging. The idea of counter-stereotypic imaging is recognizing that just like we've gotten that litany of sort of imagery that we get that maintains a level of confirmatory bias, we've got to oversaturate on the other side, right? That's why I so appreciate the different months, right? Like Hispanic Heritage Month, Native American Month, Women's History Month, right? African American Month, right? Like it gives us an opportunity to oversaturate our environments in ways that we typically wouldn't, to recognize sort of the, not only the contributions of various groups, but also the ways in which to interrupt our own sort of imagery of what we understand about individuals, right? And that has to be sort of a constant sort of opportunity that's made available. A great example of some of this counter-stereotypic imaging that we're trying to do is the types of books that kids are getting to read, right? Where particularly is who gets to be, who and what we read, who gets to be the protagonist and who gets to be the antagonist, right? And knowing sort of how that also feeds our own nature of associational bias in terms of who we're looking for, right? It's, I'm trying to remember the researcher who did this study where they had kids, they gave kids different professions and had them draw. And these were 5 to 8 year olds. And when they told them doctor, they drew the doctor with the white jacket, right? But they were all male. Doctor, astronaut, athlete, right? The kids had already had consumed enough to give it a particularized gender, right? So what's the counter-stereotypic imaging work that we do to counterbalance that, right? I'm just gonna skip through. These are different examples of schools that have done some of this work. The next one is what's called perspective taking, which is the idea of walking in somebody else's shoes. Like, how do we understand sort of the lived experiences of a range of folks when we don't know what that's like, because we haven't lived and walked through other people's shoes, right? So perspective taking is being really deliberate about developing that skill for us to be able to sit with somebody else who's different than us, whatever that may be, and being able to inquire, right, and listen in on, so can I share my story? I'd love to hear your story, right? The same way you all kind of shared in the opening activity in terms of sharing your name, right? Knowing how that sort of resonates and means is significant for individuals is a moment for us to do a level of perspective taking, right, as a constant interruption strategy. Intergroup contact, right? Perspective taking means we also have to do intergroup contact, meaning you gotta hang out with people that are different than you to really start expanding our own sort of body of knowledge that we carry, you know? I like to use these two examples, right? So the top one is George Bush and Ellen DeGeneres, and I don't know if you all remember when Ellen got a lot of flack for hanging out with George, right? And part of what I saw was intergroup contact. Two individuals who have had a very different lived experience, right? And though George Bush has a different sort of policy place, it doesn't, around LGBTQ issues, to be able to sit with somebody who does identify as part of the community, I see as an opportunity for development for both around the expansiveness, their understanding of each other. Same thing around the TV show that Martha Stewart and Snoop Dogg used to have, their cooking show. That was all intergroup contact. They were sharing stories about family and how they cooked together and what they shared, and it was so amazing to kind of see that. That's intergroup contact. Actually spending continuous dialogue with individuals to really sort of get to know sort of what is the complexity of who we are, right? It can't happen, it's not a one-off, right? The last one is, second to last one is called individuating, which is the idea of, and this is what happens within intergroup contact, is you get an opportunity to have sustained conversations and interactions that allow for you to develop an understanding of the individual characteristics of a person, separate from a stereotype that we may have constructed based on our affinity bias, right? Example I always think of is when I was in grad school, my advisor, one of my first advisors, she was a white woman, and she said to me, we were working in her office, analyzing some data, and she turned to me and she said, Eddie, I'm confused. How is it that you're Black and you speak Spanish, right? And I appreciated her honesty of like, let's just ask it, right? But I also recognized that was a moment of her individuating, where she was struggling with some stereotypes. A stereotype of that the Black diaspora includes a multitude of languages, right? and that those who speak Spanish look in a range of ways, right? That's sort of the beauty of sort of our global society, right? But what elicited that conversation was sort of that ongoing sort of individuating moment, and she was calling out her stereotype in that moment, right? And I left that information for her to kind of grapple with over time in terms of how she kind of reconciled, like, wait a second, I need to sort of disrupt or interrupt that idea that I have about the Black diaspora and who speaks Spanish, right? And then the last example, the last strategy is what's called improved decision-making. The idea of improved decision-making, and I think it's Malcolm Gladwell who talked about this, is that we are fed millions of pieces of information. And we've got to have the mental schema to be able to slow down that intake of information so that we're making surgical decisions based on good set of information, so we're not operating from places of a confirmatory or affinity bias, right? And that means, so improved decision-making is giving ourselves the habit of mind of slowing down our thinking so that we're clear around what is it that I'm hearing, what is it that I'm seeing here, how am I making strategic decisions around this, right? And there's sort of as part of the work, particularly in education, that we get to do, right? So I'm gonna end here, right? Because this is part of what I see as our ongoing cross-cultural work that can really help us expand the nature to which we get to do inclusion work in our schools, right? Where we get an opportunity to, one, interrupt those sets of biases that we're constantly being, sort of kind of fed, and the ways in which we get to utilize these strategies to not only interrupt it, but kind of build new muscle around through intergroup contact or individuating that really expands and deepens sort of our breadth and depth of sort of what we understand about each other. And that's sort of at the core of when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that we are utilizing these touch points to allow us to really improve the science of what we get to do within schools that is going to affect all of our kids. All right, so I'm gonna pause here for tonight and sort of leave room for any questions, any sort of, because I know this last bit, I just gave you a whole bunch of stuff. Yes.
I don't really have a question.
That's okay, or a comment, I'm sorry, comment.
I'm the mother of a daughter. She is in the special education group, and she's also in the gifted and talented group.
Love it.
And I think that, what I'm hearing, and I hear a lot, is that people are thinking equity means that we're bringing everybody down level, as opposed to thinking of it as bringing everybody up to a certain level. And I think that's where we need to think of it,
right? So
that we don't have this negative connotation to equity.
Right.
I think that's a big problem in the country as we're speaking. So we can't really think of it that way. Equity needs to be a positive thought, and we're looking to strive and bring everybody up as opposed to bringing them down.
Exactly. And thank you, if I may, I think what you just described in terms of your own child is what we call twice exceptional, right? And part of why I said, like, I'm glad to hear that, because what's happened over the history of special education is that we have created this bifurcation where kids who are identified with disability categories are presumed to not have gifted capacities, right? And so there are ways in which our systems have operated for years that has left our students with disabilities who have what I call who have differently abled in learning capacities, that we presume that means they don't have gifted capacities as well, right? And so part of the improvement work around sort of improving our identification is recognizing that, wait a second, there are mechanics that we have constructed in our process that have left our students' disabilities out of the opportunity for this. So you're right, it's not about, nobody's getting, sort of pulled down. We're actually sort of now able to kind of pull more kids in who demonstrate the same levels of proclivity, right? And bringing them into the fold of those set of opportunities. And that's what we've been missing out on in terms of the sort of full breadth of what we do in our education sphere. So thank you so much for sharing your own sort of personal story. Yes, oh, there's a question up here?
Two people online.
Oh, okay. I don't know if whoever.
Let's start with David.
Uh-huh. All right, go
Hello.
ahead. Yes.
Yeah, just to backtrack a tiny bit, in terms of, the whole story with the Peanuts and Franklin and everything, I think that's one of the biggest concerns that I see is that, once you get into the inclusion part, it seems like, you guys take it upon yourselves that it's going to be better to, like the other gentleman said earlier, this whole cancel culture thing. And the dangerous thing about all of that is, this is part of our history as a nation. We are not an inherently racist country. And I would argue that, to the nth degree. And, people are saying, well, this is hurtful. And so we need to act like it didn't exist. Well, that's terrible for everybody. We're learning that opportunity to learn about our history, where we did come from, where things went wrong, so we can learn how to not do things in the future. And we've gotten so much better, since back then in the 60s even. And, to just kind of make it go away, you look at the Grant statue, Grant, our president, he was the one who enacted the 12th and 14th Amendments for African Americans. And, his statue was taken down. Why is it being taken down? Oh, it's because he was from the South and he owned slaves or something. He fought with Lincoln for, everybody to be equal. That is the whole point of all of this. Equal and equity are different things.
So David, so again, I think, you've laid out a whole bunch of things there, and I think I want to be careful and be mindful of, like, in particular, I haven't mentioned anything around sort of canceling anything, but rather sort of how are we attentive to the cultural facets that we all bring to be able to sit in the room, right? So having been, sort of the set of work, being attentive to, for example, how our own history textbook, right? As somebody who used to teach history, I was cognizant that there was the moments in which African Americans were noted. The first starting point, particularly when I was teaching world history, was it started with slavery, and I was like, well, wait a second, there's a story before slavery, right? Mm-hmm. That also needs to be sort of brought into it, right? And so part of that means that we have to reconcile two things. One is, how do we bring that in? And two, also reconcile what gave permission for it to be excluded so we don't do it again, right? And both things have to happen, right? And I think that's part of what's transpiring in multiple ways, right? In some spaces, it's about removal of things, but it's also, and I'm not going to make a judgment on any of that stuff, but I want us to be cognizant of that both things have to happen, where we get to provide a moment of inclusion of this stuff, and at the same time, reconciling what gave permission for it to be excluded so we don't do it again, right? And that's sort of the dynamic of this. I know we have one other person.
CMT 10 out of capacity.
Okay, whoever CMT 10 is?
That's me. Christina, can you hear me?
Yes, definitely. Go ahead, Christina.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I was trying to look at over those slides you were just going over. And then I had some questions, like, for example, the examples for the book stories, the titles are a bit concerning and very specific. And if obviously I haven't read them or heard of them, are these suggestions of what the kids would be reading? And if so, how is that not like creating a bias against any culture or anyone in particular? I mean,
I'm not sure exactly what you're referencing. I think I know. There's two slides that I have there that are regarding interruption strategies, and it's about interruption strategies and books that can be used by adults for them to work on sort of how do they cultivate that interruption strategy through these types of books. And because you haven't read these books, right, these books are actually sort of opportunities, they represent content that we've sort of, we haven't had an opportunity in our own K-12 and college experiences to have that information sort of offered up. And so, so I have sort of a variety of books that, and I am always suggesting books to educators to help continue deepening their own sort of points of reference of information that they're seeking to really sort of understand the diversity of. So that's that's what I believe you're referencing, because there's none of this is geared towards students. This work is about educators, right, and improving their practice.
Okay, it was the slide for perspective taking. So like the titles were, "Why are all the Black kids sitting together in white fragility?" And so I didn't know if that was like going to be a suggestion for them, or.
No, it's for adults in terms of it's different books that are for adults in terms of so we can engage in sort of dialogue around sort of interruption strategies.
Okay, and then okay, well, if that's for the teachers, but how do we? I mean, there's so many thoughts that I'm thinking. It's hard to get across what I want to say. And then when, as David said with the peanut slide, I understand all sides, and I've grown up in Norwalk, and I mean, I'm white, and I'm been in a diverse area. I believe that it's your home life that brings you up, and I have never been biased or judged anybody by anything, and we've always had a very diverse community in Norwalk, and I think everything is going way too far to the other side and back and forth, and we need to be careful of how far we're going. And yes, we should show all perspectives, but the delivery, especially to the younger kids in elementary school, needs to be very careful. And I'm just hoping that is taken in consideration. And because with the Peanuts reference, we love all the Peanuts movies, and we watch them. And then over like the past year, when we watched that last Thanksgiving, it happened to come up, and my husband mentioned it. He said, "Oh, you know, people are talking about how Franklin is on the other side of the table." And I said, "Oh," and I said, "You know, I never noticed." And I mean, I don't read into that stuff that much. I know obviously other people do, but I mean, if I just never noticed it. It's not something that I was looking for. I'm just trying to enjoy a movie. So just stuff like that coming up. And if that was done on purpose, then that's horrible. But like, just for me as an individual, I was never looking for that or thinking that that was a problem.
I so appreciate that example, Christina, because I think there is, you know, there's so much of sort of our own lived experiences that there are moments where we realize, you know, I didn't notice, I didn't recognize, right? Like a short example that I'm going to give is, you know, there have been moments where my wife, who in her, you know, I remember one position she had, she was vice president of her organization, and she would come home and talk about how some of her colleagues, who were also VPs, would come and one, would explain to her what her job should be, right? And then two, would do the stand next to her and then put their arm on her shoulder whenever she wanted to speak, right? As a manner of silencing, right? And as somebody who is male in this society, right? I'm not sure what that necessarily means, because I've had a way in which I can traverse the world where those types of interactions don't necessarily happen to me as a result of how people are reading my gender, right? And it is, you know, and it's been sort of the set of learned experiences from hearing from her to recognize sort of how that are moments of disempowerment that happens within the workforce, right? And those are some of the things I realized, like, I wasn't aware of, right? But it took sort of that set of experience to kind of hear that perspective taking, that individuating, to have an opportunity to reconcile and recognize like, oh, how that happens and what it signals for individuals who are having a very different lived experience than myself, right? I'm not gonna, I always tell my wife, I can't use my lens of lived experience to be the conduit for how I am interpreting and understanding your lived experience. Yours is different, right? But my work means that I have to make sure that I take a moment to pay attention to the nuances and do my best in not only sort of recognizing, but also making sure that I'm interrupting whatever sort of associations that I may also have around this, right? So the peanuts, it may have not have been something that you were cognizant of, right? But for kids of color who may have experienced in their own lived experiences moments of segregation, it does sit in their imagination, right? So now that sort of that we're cognizant of that, how do we ensure that we are interrupting sort of the ways in which we see those things and as ways in which we sort of quell its sort of continuation? So I want to be mindful of time because it is 8:01 and we said we were going till 8 o'clock. I really appreciate everyone who's been virtual and really chimed in. I want to thank the interpreters for doing a masterful job of making sure. I know at times I speak fast, so thank you. And I want to thank everyone here for coming out tonight. Like, this is great. This is part of the perspective taking, individuating work we got to do, right? To have some of these set of dialogues to make sure that we have a moment to really grapple with what are we understanding as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, Dr. Estrella.
So I just wanted to thank everyone for being here this evening. Like I said earlier, this is one of a two-part series of conversations. The next session will be fully in person because we want to make sure we can personalize more of the conversation. But we wanted to just launch the initial one in a hybrid format. So thank you for those of you who came this evening, and I hope that this sparks more conversations amongst the community of some of the difficult conversations we have to have as a collective to continue to thrive for excellence, most importantly, making sure that all students in our community are succeeding, and really hone into when we talk about inclusion and looking at different ways of serving, that we're elevating everyone regardless of the program and services that we're providing, but most importantly, that as our, as our population is becoming more and more diverse and we have many different unique features that we have to pay attention to the learning styles and pay close attention to what they need, that we are continuing to elevate this conversation so that we become more aware of some of the things that we're doing well, but most importantly, what are some of the things that we continue to need to improve upon so that we ensure excellence for all. Because we won't be a great school district unless we are making sure that all students are served. And a lot of times information is diluted when you look at the masses, but when you scaffold down and look at things in different ways, you get to see the areas that we need work in. And we do have pockets of excellence, but at the same time, we have a lot of work to do in certain areas so that all of our students are successful. So I thank you today for taking the first step in being part of the community of learners that are focused on ensuring that all students succeed, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at the upcoming sessions. Please help us spread the word. We will be having a second series in our second series in January, and then from that part on, we will cycle again and provide the sessions again. So we're hoping that we can get more families and community members to join us so that we can have an even richer conversation. Have a great evening, and thank you for being here.